Do you sometimes feel like your own mind is your worst enemy? You're not weak, it's your brain chemistry trying to survive. Today we're going to decipher the complete map of mental disorders. Let's begin. Neurodevelopmental disorders, the brain's original blueprints. Let's start at the beginning of our story, childhood. Neurodevelopmental disorders appear early, before we even start school. Here, we aren't talking about something you catch or that appears due to trauma. We are talking about how your brain's original blueprints were built. Within this group, we find autism spectrum disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, as well as intellectual disability. What happens at a biological level? In ADHD, for example, there is lower availability of dopamine and norepinephrine in the prefrontal cortex, which is the conductor of the orchestra, the one in charge of planning and putting the brakes on impulses. Because of this, it's not that a person with ADHD doesn't care about paying attention, it's that their brain becomes physically bored if the stimulus isn't massive. In ASD, neural wiring processes sensory and social information with an overwhelming intensity. Imagine living with all your senses amplified by 1,000%. They aren't isolated in their own world, they are trying to process ours. Psychotic disorders, when the reality filter fails. Historically, this is the most stigmatized category. We are talking about schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, and delusional disorder. What is the science behind psychosis? Imagine your brain has a janitor who decides which stimuli are real and important, and which are just background noise. In psychotic disorders, due to an excess of dopamine in certain brain pathways, that janitor goes on vacation. The effect is devastating. The brain begins to assign deep meaning to random things. A blinking light becomes a coded message, a delusion. An internal thought is processed in the auditory cortex as if it came from the outside, a hallucination. For the person experiencing it, it is not a fantasy. Their biology is swearing to them that what they see or hear is just as real as the ground they step on. Mood disorders, BANES, and the emotional pendulum. Here we encounter two giants of clinical practice, major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder. Depression is not just prolonged sadness. Being sad is human. Depression is the death of vitality. Scientifically, it goes much further than a lack of serotonin. There is inflammation in the nervous system, and the hippocampus, the area of the brain that processes memories and emotions, loses volume due to chronic stress. The result is anhedonia, the absolute inability to feel pleasure. Food tastes like nothing, the love of your family feels distant, and a mental fog constantly tells you that you will never get out of there. In bipolar disorder, that fog alternates with phases of mania or hypermania. The pendulum swings to the other extreme. The brain is flooded with dopamine. The person goes days without sleep, feels a divine euphoria, spends their life savings, or experiences grand ideas of grandeur, only to later, inevitably, free fall back into the void of depression. Anxiety disorders, the broken smoke detector. We all know anxiety. It is that biological response that saves your life if you are being chased by a bear. But in generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, specific phobias, or social anxiety, that mechanism becomes paranoid. Imagine if your home's smoke detector were so sensitive that it went off at full volume every time you lit a match or boiled water. That is clinical anxiety. The amygdala, the brain's panic button, gets stuck in the pressed position. The effect on the body, a constant surge of cortisol and adrenaline. During a panic attack, your heart rate skyrockets, your lungs hyperventilate, and your mind becomes convinced that you are having a heart attack in the middle of the supermarket. Your body is reacting to an email from your boss exactly as if it were fighting for its life in the jungle. OCD and related disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, hoarding disorder, and trichotillomania, the urge to pull out one's hair, belong to a family where the mind gets trapped in an endless loop. Forget the myth that OCD is just about being neat. OCD is a hell of obsessions, intrusive, terrifying thoughts like, if I touch this railing, I will infect my child with a deadly disease. And compulsions, the action that calms the terror, like washing your hands 7 times. At a neurobiological level, there is a disconnection in the cortico-striatothalamo-cortical circuit. This is the system that tells the brain, hey, you already checked the door, it's locked, you can relax. In an OCD brain, that mission accomplished signal never arrives. The brain keeps screaming that there is danger, forcing the person to repeat the ritual over and over again to chase just a second of peace. Trauma and stressor-related disorders, the The body keeps the score. This is where post-traumatic stress disorder and adjustment disorders are located. They occur when the environment shatters our capacity to cope, usually in the face of life-threatening danger, violence, or devastating loss. When you experience a traumatic event, the impact is so colossal that the hippocampus fails to put an expiration date label on the memory. The trauma isn't archived in the past, it stays floating in the present. Because of this, the effects of PTSD include flashbacks. If a person survived a car accident, the sound of screeching brakes on the street can cause their brain to relive the impact with the exact same original chemical intensity. The nervous system remains in a state of chronic hypervigilance. The body lives in a perpetual war, even when peace has returned. Dissociative disorders, the ultimate escape mechanism. What does the mind do when the pain or terror is so immense that the body cannot physically run away? It disconnects internally. That is what dissociative disorders are about, such as dissociative amnesia or dissociative identity disorder, what used to be mistakenly called multiple personality disorder. Dissociation is like your home's circuit breaker. If there is an electrical overload, the switch trips so the appliances don't burn out. In these disorders, the mind compartmentalizes memory, identity, or consciousness. The effect is that a person might completely forget months of their life where they suffered abuse, or their psyche might fragment into different identity states so that one part of the mind carries the pain while the other tries to lead a normal life. It is a masterpiece of psychological survival, but at a very high cost to the individual's identity. Eating disorders, pain reflected in the mirror, anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder are not superficial vain whims. They are deep, dangerous psychiatric conditions. Scientifically, we know that in eating disorders, there is a dysfunction in the insula, the brain region that allows us to perceive our own body. That is why a person with anorexia looks in the mirror and sees a completely distorted silhouette. Their brain is actively lying to them. Food, or the restriction of it, becomes an emotional anesthetic. It's not about weight, it's about control. When the outside world is chaotic or the internal pain is unbearable, regulating every single calorie that enters the body with mathematical precision gives an illusion of absolute control, while the organism silently weakens biologically. Personality disorders, rigidly tinted lenses. Personality is the way we think, feel, and relate to the world. Imagine we are all wearing clear glasses. In personality disorders such as borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, or narcissistic personality disorder, the glasses are tinted with a colour so rigid and distorted that they cause constant suffering to the individual and their environment. In BPD, for example, there is hypersensitivity in the limbic system. They feel emotions raw. A 5-minute delay for an appointment isn't processed as a minor setback, but as a devastating abandonment. In antisocial disorder, there is a structural empathy deficit in the orbitofrontal cortex, which prevents them from experiencing remorse. These are not conscious decisions to be bad. They are rigid, maladaptive ways of processing human existence. Substance use and addictive disorders, the hijacking of reward. Let's talk about alcohol use disorder, opioid use disorder, or behavioral addictions like gambling disorder. Society tends to judge the addict by saying they lack willpower. Neuroscience smiles at us with sadness and says, it's not a problem of will, it's a biological hijacking. We all have a reward circuit that releases dopamine when we eat, fall in love, or achieve a goal. Chemical substances or gambling inject such a massive, artificial amount of dopamine into the brain that the reward system burns out. To protect itself, the brain shuts down its own receptors. The effect is that, over time, the person no longer consumes the substance to feel pleasure. They consume it simply to avoid feeling the unbearable pain of withdrawal. Their brain has rewired its survival priorities. The substance is more important than water or food. Sleep-wake disorders, when the night becomes an enemy. Chronic insomnia, narcolepsy, or sleep apnea. It might seem like these are purely physical problems, but their impact on mental health is titanic. Sleep is not a passive state. It is the brain's garbage truck. While you sleep during the deep phases, the glymphatic system activates to clear out the day's metabolic waste and consolidate your memory. When you suffer from chronic insomnia or narcolepsy, your brain never fully cleanses itself. The psychological effect is immediate: extreme irritability, failures in working memory, paranoia, and a 3-fold higher vulnerability to developing depression or anxiety. Not sleeping destroys our emotional stability because it robs the brain of its basic repair time. Neurocognitive disorders, the loss of the central archive. We finish our map with Alzheimer's disease, delirium, and the different forms of dementia. Unlike the previous categories here, the damage is macroscopic and irreversible. There is a physical degeneration of neurons, an accumulation of toxic proteins such as beta amyloid, and a loss of brain mass. The effect of neurocognitive disorders is watching a person's identity fade away layer by layer. First, recent memories are lost, then orientation in space, and finally the recognition of the faces of those they love most. It is the rawest reminder that everything we are, our loves, our achievements, our fears, is stored in an incredibly fragile biological medium. We have travelled across the 12 great continents of the mind. I know it can seem overwhelming to see just how much can become dysregulated inside our heads. If this journey through the map of the mind has brought you clarity, subscribe to the channel and leave me a comment. Which of all these explanations surprised you the most? Taking care of your mind is, without a doubt, the most beautiful act of bravery you can perform. See you in the next video.